Latera's Contract Companion solution is designed to help us identify potential issues in a document before that document makes it to the next stop in its drafting lifecycle, whether that's to a client or someone else within our firm. Maybe it's a document that's destined for court filing. Ultimately, our objective is to help with the currently manual proofing and review processes that our legal drafters go through today. So, as we look at potentially improving those proofing and review processes, really the objective is twofold. One, reduce the risk of errors being promoted within a document, right? Reduce the risk of errors continuing in that document as it moves from person to person. And goal number two, as much as we can, is to make that proofing and review process more efficient while also making sure that we maintain accuracy. So with that said, let's go ahead and start to jump into what Contract Companion looks like. Now, we're going to go ahead and start by clicking the Analyze button in my Latera ribbon, and you'll notice that this opens a task pane over on the right-hand side of my screen. And in this task pane, there's a number of tiles. I can click into whichever one of these tiles I would like, and each one is relatively self-explanatory. The Define Term Issues tile is going to show me potential issues associated with defined terms. The Numbering Issues tile is going to show me potential issues associated with the numbering in the document, and so on and so forth. Now, we can click into any one of these that we want. We'll go ahead and start by clicking on the Define Term Issues tile. And you'll notice, probably right off the bat, that we try to do some categorization of the content that we've identified in the document that we think needs some further review. You'll notice these red exclamation points and yellow exclamation points. Now, red exclamation points are things that we think have a high likelihood of being an issue. We call these attention items. And here you can see that we have this term closing date. We're saying this term closing date has been used, but it hasn't been defined anywhere in the document. You'll notice that when I select it, it brings me to where that term is. I can toggle through each use. We can see that this is the first of 7 uses. If I'd like to gather some additional context, I can toggle through each of the additional uses. And ultimately, I can gather some context for what I think needs to happen with this specific term. Now, there's lots more results that we can click through in here. We're not going to go into all of them, but I do want to quickly show this term collateral. Now, I had mentioned earlier that red exclamation points are things that we think have a high likelihood of being an error. We call these attention items. Yellow exclamation points are things that may not necessarily be an error, but we do think someone should look at it if they have the time and the ability to review. These are things that we call informational items. So for example, here I have this term collateral. And when I click it, you're going to notice a couple of things happen. The first is that we're dropped into a split screen view. So I can see the definition of collateral up in the top pane, and that lowercase use of collateral down in the bottom pane, and I can start to gather some context for whether or not I intended for this to be capitalized. You'll notice that the reason it's been identified is because it's used with inconsistent capitalization. And just like with closing date, I can toggle through each use. In this case, there's 2 lowercase uses of the term collateral. Now let's go ahead and click back into our main dashboard and look at some of these additional tiles. We'll look at references next. Now, references is going to show me both internal section references as well as references to external documents or legislation. You'll notice, just like with the Define Term Issues tile, we have red exclamation points and yellow exclamation points. But something new here is that we have results with no exclamation point. We'll explain that in just a minute. Now, just like with our Define Term Issues tile, we can go through and help you identify things that we think have a high likelihood of being an error. For example, here, I have this reference to section 2.01. There is no section 2.01 in the document, so we can quickly help you to identify that. Now, the rest of these section references, these are typed section references. So we're letting you know, hey, there's section references within this document, and we can't necessarily tell you whether or not there's something wrong with them, but you should know that they're manually typed, and as a result, they may be out of date if this document hasn't been updated. And when we think about the manual process that our drafters go through today in order to validate these types of section references, it is incredibly time consuming. You're going to probably have 2 copies of the same document, either open on your computer or one printed, one on screen, or some combination thereof. You're then going to read through one copy, and every time you come to an item that you're interested in, right? You come to maybe a term that's capitalized and you want to make sure it refers back to a definition, or in the example we're seeing here, you come to a section reference as set forth in section 2.1, you're going to manually flip or scroll or use the find function in Microsoft Word in the second copy of your document to that section and validate that cross-reference. And it's a really time-consuming process. Ultimately, what this allows me to do is walk through that section reference validation process, but to do it in a much more efficient way. So in this case, I can just select the section that's being referenced, in this case, section 2.1. I can see that there's 2 references to this section in the document. I'm looking at the first of 2, I can toggle to the next one. And as I look at these, I can see the content of section 2.1 up in the top pane. Ultimately, what this means is that that manual process that I go through today, where we read through a document, we scroll to the section that is being referenced, and we confirm that cross-reference, right? It means that we can help to make that process much more efficient. Now, I had said earlier we were going to talk about red exclamation points and yellow exclamation points, and we've gone through and spoken about both of those, but we also have lots of results in here that have no exclamation point. And this is the other way that we'll typically see people use Contract Companion. Now, one of our goals with Contract Companion is not just to show you things that we think might be an issue, but also to show you content that you might just care about, things that you might be interested in seeing or looking at or knowing exist within your document. Because ultimately, if I can look through the references tiles here and quickly see that I have 9 references to a promissory note, well, that's great because it gives me good information about how often this has been used, and I can even toggle to each use. So ultimately, the objective here is to go through and help to identify potential issues, but also just surface content that you might care about. Now, during this recording, we are not going to click into every tile, but we will click into the names, dates, etc. tile before we round out. The names, dates, etc. tile is going to do exactly what its name implies. It's going to show me names, dates, company names, personal names, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, the types of things that ultimately I might accidentally carry over from prior versions of a document if I'm repurposing document content. And as we all know, a very important part of our drafting process is going to be identifying a document that we've worked on in the past and ultimately repurposing language from that document. So this gives me, firstly, the ability to identify errors. For example, here, Tuesday, April 16th, 2018, well, that was actually a Monday, not a Tuesday. But also, I can use this to do things like filter my results. Maybe I want to look at company names and negotiable amounts and make sure that everything in this document looks correct. What this means is that I don't have to manually read through, try to identify anything that I think is an outlier, and then manually remove the content that I think has been preserved from a prior document. Now, ultimately, we want to make sure that as we're walking through our proofing and review processes as they currently exist, we can catch things that might otherwise be missed. We also want to make sure that if we can spend less time on these things that are perceived to be low-value tasks and ultimately spend more time on substantive document content. Now, I had said I'm not going to click into each of these tiles, but at a high level, let's talk about them. The numbering issues tile is going to identify numbering issues, right? So Article 3 followed by Article 4, those types of things are going to be identified and put into numbering issues. Editing mistakes is going to show you problems that the grammar checker or the spell checker in Word are not going to identify. Inconsistent phrases is going to show you exactly that. Phrases that are inconsistently used within your document. Right? You might say something like within 30 business days, and then you might say within 30 days, and we would consider that an inconsistent phrase that we would flag up and put into that inconsistent phrases tile. And then lastly, we have incomplete items, which is going to show us things that aren't done. Notes to draft, highlighted text, text in square brackets, things like that. And of course, to round it out, we have definitions in all results, definitions showing us all the definitions in the document, and all results showing us everything that Contract Companion has identified. Hopefully the objective here has become fairly clear and you understand how you can potentially leverage Contract Companion to identify issues that otherwise might be missed as part of a manual drafting and review process. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Latera in follow-up.